What if the answer to breaking free from debt wasn't hidden in some Wall Street boardroom, but sitting right there on your grandmother's kitchen table, waiting for a 12-year-old boy to discover it? Tommy Martinez pressed his face against the cold library window, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears on weathered cheeks. The smell of old books and broken dreams filled the Millfield Public Library, where fluorescent lights flickered over empty computer stations that hadn't worked properly since the factory closed 3 years ago. His sneakers squeaked against the worn linoleum as he shuffled toward the single functioning computer, carrying a crumpled piece of paper with numbers that made his stomach churn. $12,000. That's what the hospital wanted from Abuela María for the surgery that saved her life but might cost them their home. Tommy's fingers trembled as he typed, "How to make money fast," into the search bar, then deleted it, feeling foolish. The cursor blinked at him mockingly, like everyone else in this forgotten town who looked at him with a mixture of pity and resignation. Outside, Millfield's main street stretched like a scar through the heart of what used to be America's promise. Boarded storefronts, rusted for-lease signs, and Jake Morrison's gleaming black SUV parked outside Martinez Family Market, where Senora Rodriguez was probably signing another loan agreement that would trap her family deeper in debt. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows with the same relentless rhythm that debt collectors used when they called every evening at dinner time. Tommy's reflection stared back at him from the computer screen, dark eyes that had seen too much for 12 years, messy black hair that Abuela always tried to comb down, and the determined set of his jaw that reminded everyone of his father before the industrial accident claimed both his parents. He thought about the documentary he'd glimpsed on the communal television at the community center last week. Something about digital money, Bitcoin, people becoming millionaires overnight. The other kids had changed the channel to cartoons, but Tommy couldn't shake the image of ordinary people, people who looked like his neighbors, holding up phones and talking about financial freedom. Sarah Thompson, the librarian, approached quietly, her worn cardigan dragging across the floor. She'd been watching him struggle with homework and hope in equal measure for months now. "Find what you're looking for, Tommy," she asked, her voice carrying the gentleness of someone who understood that some searches were about survival, not curiosity. He looked up at her with eyes that held the weight of his family's future. "Miss Sarah," he whispered, "what do you know about Bitcoin?" The question hung in the air between them like a prayer whispered in a language neither of them fully understood, but both desperately needed to learn. Outside, Jake Morrison's SUV pulled away from the market, leaving behind another family trapped in the golden cage of easy credit and impossible terms. While inside the library, a boy was about to discover that sometimes revolution comes disguised as education, and freedom hides in the most unexpected places. Sarah Thompson's eyes widened slightly, as if Tommy had just asked her to explain quantum physics using only crayons and construction paper. She glanced around the empty library, her fingers nervously adjusting the reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck like a talisman against ignorance. "Bitcoin," she repeated, the word sounding foreign in the hushed sanctuary of books that smelled of vanilla and forgotten dreams. That's complicated, honey." But Tommy had learned that when adults said something was complicated, it usually meant they were scared of it, not that it was impossible to understand. He'd figured out how to fix Abuela's ancient sewing machine using YouTube videos, taught himself enough English to translate hospital bills, and memorized bus routes to 3 different cities, just in case they ever needed to run. Complicated was just another word for not yet learned. Sarah walked to her desk, her orthopedic shoes making soft whispers against the floor, and returned with a manila folder that looked like it had been hiding secrets. "There's someone in town," she said quietly, glancing toward the windows as if Jake Morrison might be listening through the glass. "David Chen. He used to work for some big tech company out in California before he moved here 2 years ago. Lives in that blue house on Elm Street, the one with all the computers visible through the windows." Tommy's heart began to race the way it did, when he solved a particularly difficult math problem. That electric feeling of pieces clicking into place. You think he knows about Bitcoin? I think he knows about a lot of things most people around here don't understand, Sarah replied, then leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of shared conspiracy. But Tommy, you need to understand something. David, he doesn't talk to people. Groceries get delivered to his door, bills get paid online, and I've seen him maybe 5 times in 2 years. He's not unfriendly, just haunted, I suppose, like he's running from something. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the library windows, each drop carrying Tommy's hopes higher or washing them away completely. He thought about Abuela at home, probably sitting in her favorite chair with the broken spring, mending clothes for neighbors who paid her in tamales, and promises because cash was a luxury none of them could afford. She never complained, never showed the fear that must have been eating at her like cancer, but Tommy had seen the bills stacked on the kitchen counter like accusations, each one stamped with red letters that screamed urgency. "Miss Sarah," Tommy said, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even him. "If someone could help my abuela, if there was even a chance, wouldn't it be worth trying?" Sarah studied his face, seeing something that reminded her of her own grandson before life taught him that hope was a dangerous luxury. She walked to the window and pointed toward Elm Street, where a blue house sat apart from its neighbors like an island of possibility in an ocean of surrender. "House number 247, she said simply. "But Tommy, promise me something. If he says no, you accept it and come back here. Some people build walls not to keep others out, but to keep themselves from falling apart." As Tommy gathered his courage like armor around his shoulders, Sarah returned to her desk and made a phone call she'd been avoiding for months. Because sometimes the universe needs a gentle push, and sometimes librarians are the guardian angels that make sure lost souls find each other when hope hangs by the thinnest of threads. The rain began to ease, and through the clearing clouds, a shaft of sunlight illuminated the path toward Elm Street, where a reclusive programmer was about to discover that redemption sometimes comes knocking with the voice of a child who refuses to accept that poverty is permanent. The blue house at 247 Elm Street stood like a digital fortress in a neighborhood of analog surrender, its windows glowing with the cold light of multiple computer screens that painted geometric patterns on the overgrown lawn. Tommy stood at the gate for 10 full minutes, his wet sneakers squelching in the mud, while his courage battled with the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like every adult who'd ever told him to know his place. David Chen was inside somewhere, probably surrounded by technology that cost more than most families in Millfield made in a year, and Tommy was just a kid with a crumpled hospital bill and a desperate prayer. But desperation, he'd learned, was sometimes the only fuel strong enough to power impossible dreams. He pushed through the gate, walked up the cracked concrete path, and knocked on the door with the kind of determination that only comes from having nothing left to lose. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot in a library, followed by a silence so complete Tommy wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing. Then footsteps, slow and reluctant, approached the door. When it opened, Tommy found himself staring at a man who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts and held together with caffeine and regret. David Chen was thin in the way that suggested he forgot to eat when he was coding. His black hair hung in strands that hadn't seen a barber in months, and his eyes carried the particular exhaustion that comes from staring at screens for 18 hours a day. He wore a faded t-shirt advertising some tech conference from 2019 and sweatpants that had given up all pretense of being presentable. "I don't want whatever you're selling," David said, already starting to close the door. But Tommy wedged his foot in the gap with the reflexes of someone who'd learned that opportunity knocks exactly once. "We don't want debt, sir," Tommy said, the words rushing out like water from a broken dam. "Can you teach us Bitcoin?" David froze, his hand still on the doorknob, as if Tommy had just spoken an incantation that shattered whatever spell had been keeping him hidden from the world. He stared down at this kid who couldn't be older than 12, standing in the rain with shoes that were more holes than leather and eyes that burned with the kind of desperate intelligence that reminded David of himself at that age, before Silicon Valley taught him that innovation without conscience was just expensive exploitation. "What did you say?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tommy pulled the hospital bill from his jacket pocket, the paper soft with wear and worry. "My abuela owes $12,000 for surgery that saved her life, and Jake Morrison keeps offering loans that'll trap us forever. I heard about Bitcoin making people free from banks, and Miss Sarah said you might know about it." David looked at the bill, at Tommy's earnest face, at the neighborhood around them where American dreams went to die, slowly and quietly, and something inside his chest cracked open like an egg that had been frozen for too long. He'd spent 2 years hiding from the consequences of his previous life, building algorithms that financial predators used to harvest money from communities exactly like this one. Now here was a kid, rain-soaked and desperate, asking him to be the solution instead of the problem. "Kid," David said, running a hand through his unkempt hair, "Bitcoin isn't magic. It's not going to solve your problems overnight, and it's definitely not going to make you rich quick." But Tommy stepped closer, his small frame radiating the kind of stubborn hope that could move mountains, or at least convince programmers to care about something other than code. "I don't need magic, sir. I need education. I need to understand how money really works, so people like Jake Morrison can't trick my neighbors anymore." And in that moment, David Chen realized that redemption sometimes arrives disguised as responsibility, and the very thing you've been running from might be exactly what you need to run toward. 3 weeks later, the Millfield Public Library had transformed into something that resembled an underground resistance meeting more than a quiet sanctuary for book lovers. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, after the official closing time, Sarah Thompson would unlock the side door and let in a small group of people who moved through the shadows like they were planning a revolution, which, in a way, they were. Tommy sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, a salvaged laptop balanced on his knees, while David Chen stood before a whiteboard covered in diagrams that looked like ancient hieroglyphs to most of the assembled group. María Martinez occupied a folding chair near the back, her weathered hands clutching a rosary as she tried to understand how her 12-year-old grandson had convinced a hermit programmer to emerge from his digital cave. Around them sat the Rodriguez family, the elderly Mr. Park from the corner market, single mother Jennifer Walsh with her twin daughters, and a handful of other neighbors who'd been ground down by Jake Morrison's predatory lending machine. They were the walking wounded of American capitalism, people who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't afford to get sick, who paid rent on time for 20 years but couldn't qualify for a mortgage, who understood that the system was rigged but had never imagined they might learn to play by different rules. Money, David was explaining, his voice carrying the patience of someone who'd learned that true teaching requires breaking down walls of fear before you can build foundations of knowledge, is really just information, a promise, a shared agreement that this piece of paper or this number on a screen represents value. Tommy watched his neighbors' faces, seeing the moment when abstract concepts started clicking into place like puzzle pieces finding their proper positions. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. "So when Jake Morrison lends us money at 30% interest, he's not actually giving us anything real. He's just typing numbers." "Exactly," David said, turning to write on the whiteboard. "And Bitcoin is different because no one person controls it. No Jake Morrison can decide to trap you with impossible terms. It's a system where the community makes the rules together." But even as hope began to bloom in the room like flowers pushing through concrete, Tommy noticed the shadows moving outside the library windows. Jake Morrison's black SUV had been circling the building for the past 10 minutes, its tinted windows reflecting the streetlights like predator eyes. The loan shark had built his empire on keeping people ignorant about their options, and education was the one threat he couldn't buy, intimidate, or foreclose on. Tommy stood up, his young voice cutting through the murmur of excited conversation. "Mr. Morrison knows we're here," he said simply, pointing toward the window where the SUV had finally parked, its engine idling like a mechanical heartbeat. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look, their faces showing the familiar fear of people who'd learned that challenging power came with consequences. Maria crossed herself and whispered a prayer in Spanish, while Jennifer Walsh instinctively moved to shield her daughters. But David Chen stepped forward, something burning in his eyes that Tommy had never seen before. "Good," David said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Let him see what happens when a community decides to educate itself instead of accepting exploitation." Through the window, they could see Jake Morrison's silhouette in the driver's seat, talking rapidly into his phone, probably calling in favors or threats that had kept Millfield under his thumb for so long. The revolution had been quiet until now, hidden in the margins and conducted in whispers, but some fights can only stay secret for so long before they demand to be seen. The confrontation came on a Thursday morning when Jake Morrison walked into the Martinez kitchen like he owned it, which, according to the papers in his briefcase, he soon would. Tommy was at the stove making breakfast for Abuela María, scrambled eggs with peppers from their tiny garden, when the door opened without a knock. Morrison filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his expensive suit a sharp contrast to the humble surroundings of chipped linoleum and hand-me-down furniture. His smile was the kind that bank robbers wore in old movies, all teeth and no warmth. "Maria," he said, settling his bulk into a chair that creaked under his weight, "we need to talk about your situation. The hospital's getting impatient, and I can only hold them off so long." Tommy set down the spatula and turned to face the man who'd been haunting his family's dreams. Morrison was everything Tommy had learned to hate about the system that kept people like his neighbors trapped, well-fed while others went hungry, confident while others lived in fear, powerful while others felt powerless. But 3 weeks of David's lessons had taught Tommy that knowledge was the one weapon that couldn't be taken away by foreclosure notices or threatening phone calls. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy said, his voice steady, despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs, "we've been learning about alternatives to traditional lending. Did you know that peer-to-peer financing and cryptocurrency crowdfunding could help families avoid predatory interest rates?" Morrison's smile faltered, replaced by something colder and more calculating. He'd built his empire on the assumption that poor people would stay ignorant about their options, that desperation would always trump education. A 12-year-old boy quoting financial alternatives was like finding a crack in the foundation of his carefully constructed kingdom. "What kind of nonsense has someone been filling your head with, kid?" Morrison's voice carried the edge of a man who just realized his prey might be learning to fight back. "Tommy, go to your room," Maria said quietly, but her grandson shook his head. "Abuela, he needs to hear this. Mr. Morrison, what if I told you that we could raise the money for the hospital bills through a community fundraising campaign using digital currency? What if we didn't need your loan at 30% interest?" Morrison stood up so quickly, his chair scraped against the floor like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Listen, you little punk, I don't know what fairy tales you've been reading, but real life doesn't work that way. Your grandmother signs these papers today, or tomorrow the hospital turns your debt over to collections, and collections doesn't care about your computer games." But Tommy had been preparing for this moment, practicing the words that David had taught him, understanding that sometimes you have to speak truth to power, even when power has better lawyers. "The thing is, Mr. Morrison," Tommy said, pulling out his phone and opening an app that David had helped him install, "we already started the campaign. Look, on the screen was a crowdfunding page titled, 'Help Abuela Maria Keep Her Home,' complete with photos of Maria at her sewing machine, testimonials from neighbors whose clothes she'd mended, and a progress bar that showed $3,047 already raised in digital donations from around the world." Morrison stared at the phone like it was a snake that had just bitten him, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked suspiciously like fear. Because for the first time in his career of exploiting desperation, Jake Morrison was facing an enemy he couldn't intimidate, foreclose on, or buy off. The power of a connected community that refused to accept that poverty was permanent. 6 months later, the Millfield Public Library looked nothing like the quiet refuge where Tommy had first whispered his desperate question about Bitcoin. The building buzzed with an energy that reminded visitors of a startup company or a community organizing center. Computers humming with purpose, while neighbors helped neighbors navigate digital wallets, crowdfunding campaigns, and peer-to-peer lending platforms that had nothing to do with Jake Morrison's predatory empire. Tommy stood before a packed auditorium, no longer the scared 12-year-old with holes in his shoes, but a confident young man whose story had spread far beyond the borders of their forgotten town. Representatives from 3 universities wanted to study the Millfield model. Documentary filmmakers had come to capture their transformation, and other struggling communities were sending delegations to learn how a dying Rust Belt town had become a beacon of financial literacy and digital empowerment. The secret, Tommy told the audience, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned that revolution often starts with a single question asked to the right person at the right time, wasn't Bitcoin itself. It was education. It was community. It was refusing to accept that being poor meant staying powerless. In the front row, Abuela María beamed with pride that radiated like sunshine, her home safe and her medical bills paid through a combination of cryptocurrency donations, community support, and a payment plan negotiated with hospital administrators who suddenly found themselves dealing with informed advocates instead of desperate supplicants. David Chen sat beside her, no longer the haunted recluse hiding behind computer screens, but a man who discovered that his technical skills became meaningful only when they served human dignity. The transformation hadn't been without casualties. Jake Morrison's lending business had collapsed when customers educated about their alternatives simply stopped accepting his terms. He'd left town 3 months ago, his black SUV disappearing down the interstate like a bad memory finally fading. The empty storefront that once housed Morrison Financial Services now displayed a bright banner reading, "Millfield Community Credit Union, by the people for the people." But the real victory wasn't measured in saved homes or defeated loan sharks. It was visible in the faces of neighbors who'd learned to see themselves not as victims of economic forces beyond their control, but as active participants in shaping their own financial futures. Mrs. Rodriguez had started a digital marketing cooperative for local artisans. Mr. Park had launched a micro-lending circle that helped immigrant families build credit without predatory terms. Jennifer Walsh was 2 semesters into a computer science degree funded by scholarship programs she'd learned to navigate. As Tommy concluded his presentation, he looked out at an audience that included his former neighbors and visitors from around the world, all gathered to witness what happened when a community decided that knowledge was more powerful than desperation, that education was more valuable than exploitation, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply teaching people that they deserved better. The boy who'd knocked on a programmer's door with nothing but hope and a hospital bill had discovered that the answer to breaking cycles of poverty wasn't hidden in some distant boardroom or government office. It was right there in the connection between human beings who chose to lift each other up instead of stepping on each other to climb higher. And in a small library in Ohio, the future was being written one educated mind at a time.